Okay, so welcome everyone again to this joint International Society for History and Theory of Intellectual Property and Warwick Law School seminar. I'm really pleased to welcome Professor Kathy Bowrey to today's seminar. And she will be talking about open sciences, progressive potential, and offer a critical intellectual property perspective to that. So I would like to give the floor to Kathy, and her talk will last about 30 minutes, after which I will open up the floor to questions and comments. I think we are kind of used to the online format, so we'll proceed in the usual manner. You can raise your hand with the Zoom function, the raised hand function, and then I will record the order of the hands raised, and then hopefully we can have a productive discussion around that. I would also ask you to mute your microphones if you're not speaking. That will just improve the quality of the recording. So thank you very much, and I give the floor to Kathy.
Thanks, Hugh. Thanks to Warwick for hosting me for this visit and the ISHTIP community for allowing this talk. I apologise for my voice. I've managed to pick up some kind of COVID type cold, even though we've got such horrendously hot weather here in London. So if I'm not clear or my dictionary is not clear, I apologise in advance for that. So this talk is really work in progress. It's more like a speculative musing about the times that we're in, than a kind of like a tight, neat talk, which comes to a perfect conclusion. How it comes about is that in a sense the synergy between open science and critical IP, and trying to work out what that is and what might be useful in that, for changing some of the dynamics that we all face in the world. So, open science is about reasserting scholarly values and collaboration over the infrastructure that supports scholarly communication. Mindful that multinational publishers are currently controlling the design of the research ecosystem in the interests of exclusivity and profit. Um, and this works against community and public interests, including social justice, access to knowledge, pandemic readiness, and sustainability outcomes. Critical IP thinking should be on the same page as open science because critical IP is also looking to philosophical, material, and institutional practices that mediate access to knowledge and culture, and to a lesser extent also considers the socio-legal effects of these interactions. So what I'm talking about is really my immersions in both these worlds and thinking about the extent to which they do and they don't meet up. So, for those of you who are unfamiliar with open science, you can see from the UNESCO recommendation of on open science that it's talking about principles, practices, and institutional commitments. So, many of the variables that gel with critical understandings of law and the importance of material practices to understanding intellectual property. It's a global movement and one that many researchers, laboratories, national governments have embraced, but in different ways. And here, science is not limited to STEM, but is considered to simply to be robust scholarly research. So, in terms of the UNESCO recommendation on open science that most countries in the world have signed up to, open science commitments are expressed in terms of these types of action items that you can see on the screen. And nation states are actually tasked with actually physically reporting back with data about their progress in meeting these expectations. So, in a way, it's about using a concept of open science to redesign the information infrastructure, targeting norms, values, policies, technologies, institutions, global networks, and power and private power. So, again, many of the same components that arise in critical IP scholarship and in STS. The other point of similarity is, of course, that the political agenda is crafted in reaction to private control over knowledge as it has been enabled by our copyright regimes. As academics, most of us will actually know of all these companies, I suspect, but perhaps not the extent of their business scope and control over information, tools, and resources. In IP, we tend to talk about, and in academia, in fact, we tend to talk about these as publishing companies that also perhaps control data, but that is really, as 20 years, not really what they do now and how they create profits from academic labour, generally free academic labour. So the Elsevier RELX Group is a British multinational which describes itself as an analytics company providing scientific, technical, medical information, analytics, legal information, legal analytics, decision-making tools, and organising exhibitions, by which they mean scholarly and professional conferences. Wiley, of course, is the US multinational. Informa is a British publishing, business intelligence, and exhibitions groups. Springer Nature is a result of the merger of Springer Science and Business Media with Macmillan Science and Education. The Nature Publishing Group, Palgrave Macmillan, and the global businesses of Macmillan Education. You can see a lot of the vertical and horizontal integration in play in the constructions of these businesses. Sage Publishing is actually just a subset of the British multinational enterprise software company. So whilst there's that political concern, there is a philosophical continuity in open science with very conventional ideas of science as an evidence-based discipline, which should be subject to principles of transparency, accountability, and incremental progression that proceeds by ongoing correction. So open science has strands that are very concerned about research integrity, the replication crisis that's acknowledged in some fields in research, that is the concern that published research is unable to be used as a building block because of inadequacies in the disclosure or misinformation within the methodology or data subsets. Also, the question of the need for expert mediation of research to ensure that the methodologies upon which conclusions are based are in fact sound. Open science is not exclusively relevant to publicly funded research. It's adopted by some of the philanthropic funders, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that also funds private research outputs. But universities and our public funding agencies are concerned that research outputs paid for by the taxpayer are not withheld to others due to publishers' use of exclusive IP rights, requiring more fees to pay access to the information or data that the public has already effectively subsidised or paid for. That publishers should not be creating obstacles to building on knowledge and also creating further impediments for diverse populations from being able to participate in research and benefit from it. You can see from the quote on the screen, there is this idea of knowledge as an ordered assemblage of objects and procedures. Open science sees knowledge as building blocks. It reconstructs these in terms of things like preprints, actual final version of record publications, data, samples. But open science as a movement tends to question the process of commodification of these and the control over access and assembly that occurs through private intermediaries designing the information infrastructure. There was a huge effort with the pandemic, of course, to accelerate research using open science platforms and tools, which showed advantages to progressing research over traditional methods, concerted efforts to remove barriers to participation or barriers to the benefits of vaccine research, and to do this required sharing of things like biological materials, sample, the coding of those samples, open contributions. So anybody can put data in, open access, so everyone can get access to current research through print servers and get the data out equally. Open source databases, so you can understand how the information data set is being governed, what kind of metadata is being attached, who's controlling that metadata, who's making decisions about the underlying structure of the research data. And is there an appropriate traceability and responsibility for information once it has been compiled? After the pandemic, the COVID test tape suggested that there should be progress, and that has sort of settled on the question about whether or not there should be a pandemic agreement. But basically what COVID also made transparent is some of the obstacles. So there's lots of problems in the legal frameworks that impede the development or the sharing and the collaboration, which was considered to be productively globally. And on the screen, I've put some of those, that the terms and licensing conditions of the publishers allowing for the sharing information was either subject matter specific or time limited or both. That there wasn't appropriately robust traceability and accountability of the inputs. that there was different types of governance, but what was particularly lacking was system-level governance, tracing how these various components, these different types of building blocks that make knowledge in the relevant sense are actually compiled together. Whilst there is text and data mining in many jurisdictions, this is also quite limited, and there's no harmonious approach to what can and can't be done in terms of text and data mining. Even where there was a commitment to data access reciprocity, i.e. if you put data in, you're expected, data out, you're expected to also return data to the data set so that people can continue to build on that. There's questions about the quality of some of the information that is returned to the system that, excuse me, without the appropriate curation of that information, it actually doesn't advance the data set, but actually potentially makes it unusable by putting low quality data back in. And whilst in open science communities and civil society actors, generally there was a commitment to the FAIR principles, that research should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable in terms of its digital assets. The ability to actually participate in that was somewhat missing in some quarters. Sorry about the coughing. So the tension between open science and basically an IP, conventional private IP worldview can be seen in the way that the pandemic treaty came to be settled. The principles of open science, access to research, rapid sharing of information results is prioritised, but there's no mandated infrastructure or governance to ensure the delivery of access or benefits except on the terms that nation states actually choose. Sorry. Those beholden to big pharma can thus reap the advantages of participation, but not necessarily commit to FAIR principles. That is, doing the work that ensures that the information resources are able to be used by others in a reliable way when they want it. But technology is discussed in the pandemic treaty in a very interesting and expansive way. Knowledge, skills, expertise, cooperation on know-how, licensing, capacity building, relationship facilitating, building the appropriate incentives so that research is linked to development, etc. But whilst there's a move away from seeing IP in terms of strictly patents and licensing, to consider how these rights sit within a larger research ecosystem, depending on personnel networks and materialities. IP is differently placed here in relation to other treaties, such as the TRIPS agreement in particular, that most of the IP community will be familiar with. But as subject matter of the UNESCO recommendation, you can see here that the role of IP is, however, quite ambiguous. There's a presumption that for open science to operate, we need to know that that information exists, which often is addressed in terms of breaking down the conditions of accessing publications and accessing data case by case, instance by instance. There's a need for physical access to the container and the content, but that too might be subject to different types of licensing arrangements. The code and the usage may also be subject to different types of licensing conditions. So at the moment, whilst there might be a high-level principle commitment to open science, there's multiple points where there are diverse institutional national IP practices which are going to mediate what openness actually means. So summing up how open science generally intersects with IP, open science still tends to be constructed in somewhat of a binary association with exclusive rights, is primarily understood as a normative condition mediated by particular sites through licensing terms. The relevance of IP is actually quite hard to grasp overall because it's simply being constructed by myriad discrete site-specific decisions as these are needed. There's no particular approach which is articulated defining what is the nature of the attachment between scholarly expressions and the author or the content creator. And there's a privilege of what the user's understanding of the community function of the license actually is. Okay. So I'm going to leave that discussion of open science now and turn to look at how this gels with critical IP as I understand it. So critical IP is usually interested in the author function to actually understand how it facilitates commodification of knowledge. But the question is, why did modernity need IP in the first place, or need the author function? So the story goes that the author in copyright was needed to bound the intangible right attached to the protected expression. Author and text are twin concepts. The author concept is an enabling device that facilitates commodification of copyright subject matter, but how author and text connects is actually impacted by the particular technologies and structures that regulate access to it. With patents, the concept of the inventor has a different manifestation of authorship because the relevant text is the patent specification, whose authorship is tied to the persons who provided the inventive concept, as expressed by the patent attorney that inscribes it. But in both copyright and in patent, IP remains the organising principles that trace the control mechanisms that regulate access to knowledge and culture, that structure how we participate in and interact with culture and science so that knowledge can be individuated, bounded, owned, and exchanged. So critical IP says IP is basically based on a sleight of hand. For all the rhetoric about property ownership and the exclusive rights of the author or the inventor, modern IP is not about ownership of intangible property at all. It's about creation systems of management and control of knowledge and deployment of new technologies. IP asserts that the concept of balancing private rights and public goods, exceptions to private rights, and in modernity, the dominant calibration facilitates ongoing appropriation of labour. There's accumulation of power through assemblages of IP portfolios that aided historical and vertical integration, the rise of the big communication companies, the publishers, the knowledge companies that we now know today are much merged into much larger types of arrangements. IP also worked in relation to corporate practices of tax avoidance and a lot of anti-competitive practices. Historically, we know IP has been very fickle when it actually comes to supporting authors and inventors and any imagined sacred connection between the author and the text. So a core function of IP in modernity has been the management of flows of information, flows of capital, and mainly understood in terms of the expansionist logic of the international economic system that developed in the 20th century. Okay. So what's that got to do with the university sector? So on the screen, I've got a reference to a large project that I did with some IP colleagues a couple of years ago, concluding last year, involving quite a lot of field work with, in an Australian context, researchers, research managers, senior executives and library staff in understanding what they actually think and understand by IP and what they actually understand about these practices. Obviously, we still attach our names to copyrights, works and inventions in academia. Attribution remains the organising principle that facilitates the licensing of our publications, and that creates control mechanisms that regulate access to knowledge and culture. But in an academic context today, I would query that the extent to which IP is actually the mechanism through which our knowledge is being individuated and valued. What our research found, there's a summary on the screen, is that researchers really don't have any confidence, let alone understanding in managing IP rights. Sorry. They actually don't read the policies. They don't understand if they try to read them. And if they do try to read them and enforce their rights against, for example, a publisher, they find they're unable to do so in any case. So it's just not really relevant to how they actually interact with their policies. Data management policies had the same kind of precision. Even though there might be mandatory deposit of data, it's not really clear at what level of the data and how organised that data has to be for it to be deposited. So it's not being deposited in the sense, for example, that open science would require. I was not surprised, but most of our interviews didn't actually know what had actually happened with any of their IP agreements. They would say, oh, well, it will be in my email if I needed it. Why that actually matters is it means in a university context, the library and or the institution is actually often quite dependent on what the publisher notifies to them as being the appropriate rights, because they can't rely on the actual academic to provide that information. So all understandings of IP are very context specific. But in a nutshell, we found that Australian researchers, at least, were not all that interested in either open science norms or intellectual property rights in the way that the literature actually suggests. Their day-to-day decision makings are actually much more pragmatic. They're time poor. There's an enormous resentment at the amount of free labour that we provide to all aspects of the system, from peer review. Like peer review was referred to as like picking up being an Uber driver and being expected to pick up a job. Um, that but so there's an awareness that there might be a broader international publishing system that is part of the puzzle, but there's not much engagement in those processes. My view was also that most senior managers, including senior legal counsel, actually lack any expertise to understand the implications of any individual IP decisions they make on case to case or site to site on how that's going to affect the research ecosystem overall. In fact, because of the way there's a division of labour at senior levels of most universities, and this is the same as in the UK, because the research division is on the one side and the education provision is on the other, the fact that that the IP arrangements might actually affect both parts of the of those types of services of the university is simply not understood, and there's no capacity to bring those bodies together. Funders, we found, did actually understand the operations and the problems with the publishing system, but not necessarily the interactions with patent. So this is a big ask, but assuming that this Australian data, it's only one small study, is actually taken as granted as having some validity more generally of academic culture at the moment, how then are we supposed to understand the relationship between the intellectual work we do in knowledge creation and the research outputs that we actually make? So there's a body of science within scholarship with open science that looks at called meta science or research on research. And it suggests that material conditions we work upon as academics, set by things like the research assessment exercises we're subject to, and the ability to access public and philanthropic funds, the grant conditions, is doing the work that is individuating the work and affecting how we participate in and interact in research communities. And it is doing the work that we used to consider the author function was doing. Attribution of authorship matters in terms of research assessment, track record, grant opportunities, but also at researcher level, there's considerable skepticism about the publisher produce system, the metrics that publishers produce about assessing performances of individuals, the merits of projects when it comes to winning funds and assessing research performance. So the report on the life by Rory, Research on Research Institute, which is a very important UK research institute, shows that one of the biggest predictors of funding success and career success is previous funding track record. The Rory team collected and analysed more than 100,000 applications, 14 different funding programs, 6 research funding organisations, 4 countries. Early grant success was a strong predictor of winning funding later on. It wasn't that people assessing grants thought because people had previously been successful that meant they should be funded over newcomers to the grant scheme. What they found tend to happen was that previously funded researchers continue to apply more often for further funding throughout their careers, and that's why they ended up dominating the allocations. The study on the right is an Australia and New Zealand study looking at what happens when you actually change funding formulas to not the so-called merit-based system, but to a lottery. They said, the results are more democratic, and their preliminary study found that actually, arguably, it could lead to a much wider research productivity overall than the current allegedly merit-based system. Okay. So how does this thinking about the research ecosystem impact upon what we understand about the connection between authors, text, and value creation in our scholarly context? I'd be really interested in talking to you about what are the commodity or commodities that are now being produced in this kind of research environment. There's a link to attribution of authorship and responsible research. And you can see on the left some of the, I guess, mechanisms which are considered to be useful for advancing the trust and reliability of research. But you can see here that best practice designed by meta-science researchers doesn't actually have authorship really doing any of the work. It's not really a relevant criteria for connecting researchers and research outputs. Lots of research community authored processes here have disciplinary consequences for particular researchers if you're found to not actually live up to community expectations. A lot of these efforts are designed to improve the process of tracing and authenticating the building blocks of research, including accelerating corrections, increasing transparencies. But the system is really not focused on improving, it's not really about the researcher, but actually about improving systemic outcomes without a consideration of the researcher. The interest in systemic outcomes build on the language of accelerating research and increasing research productivity, priorities of innovation policy. So a shift from caring about IP policy could be seen as IP now becoming a mere adjunct or subset to innovation policy. Some of you might be aware of the recent executive order by President Trump, which actually tends to weaponize a lot of the priorities or principles of open science. Again, here, IP is not seen as a relevant primary sort of mediation at all. The Trump restoration of gold standard is really linked to his political attacks on the integrity of universities and other knowledge keepers and displaces the democratic consensus-oriented community moderation, collaboration, and social justice ethics that have historically defined research communities, and in place creates a hierarchical government authority over research practice to be designed by the Office of Science and Technology Policy Director. And this policy will apply to all employees involved in, quote, generation, use, interpretation, communication of scientific information, regardless of their actual job classification, and it applies to all agency decision making. Okay, so let me put this together into some kind of concluding observation. Why I'm interested in us thinking more about the interaction between open science, IP, and techno-scientific capitalism is there's a codependency on technical mediation of knowledge in both the progressive and the authoritarian models of open science. In both, authorship is morphing from a traditional IP relationship between researcher and text that secures intangible properties into reliance on the DOI, authors as data identifiers, and the data identifiers simply need to better manage and authenticate and trust the data flows. So open science has the same symbolic investment in the individualization of ideas and credit as techno-scientific capitalism, with the main point of difference being the embracing of open technological tools, platforms, and metrics, traceability and accountability. In both the progressive and authoritarian forms, the author function is readily served by the cyborg. So, for example, OpenAlex is designed as an open replacement for industry standard scientific knowledge bases like Elsevier's Scopus or Claravat's Web of Science, but it's designed to do exactly the same job. Human mediation and human connection to knowledge is completely being effaced, and the knowledge output is not fixed but rendered as data, subject to ongoing processing. The outputs are generated on demand, marked either open or marked closed. What we seem to be moving towards is the connection between author and text being atomized, vaporized, universalized, and modularized. As a humanities scholar and historian, and as an interdisciplinary reader, I think this open science way of thinking about governance is a teleology of knowledge that is very specific to the times we're in. Sorry. And open science is uncritically reproducing a machine logic of really platform capitalism, whilst aspiring to be able to deliver everything from social justice from the global south to climate action. I wouldn't want to gloss over the humanist commitments of open science, but they remain largely fueled by voluntary labour. Civil society actors collaborating to achieve public outcomes, from providing peer reviews to designing open systems to running professional and institutional governance of journals and data sets, injecting humanist ideas into the design of this technological infrastructure to achieve desirable public outcomes. requires a much more sustainable public investment in the scholarly communications infrastructure if it is to function as a substitute for commercial provisions of the technological infrastructure, which is increasingly what academics would be considered as the publisher plus the AI company designed as one. In fact, one of the reasons I find the whole discussion around copyright and AI is so I'm so despondent about it is the idea of focusing on things like opt-in or opt-out is simply just, again, open closed, how to actually continue to shore up the model. There's a need for public funding, which jars with the parlous labour conditions in academic and the funding withdrawal in the sector overall. And while government's claiming to be increasingly looking to innovation, there's at the same time, there's a global de-investment of public design of knowledge ecosystems altogether. And instead, there's the occasional rearticulation of the inherent values of intellectual property rights for particular mission-oriented projects, particular bespoke research projects that the state has an investment in, or more generally to pressure universities to move down commercialisation pathways overall, as if this kind of substitute or life raft for system health. And so the datification of research continues alongside the devaluing of the state's own institutions that are capable of humanising it. So I think that there is real work and really useful work and really productive and progressive work that can be done by open science research collectivities, by research government, by research communities, if they are allowed to function as a substitute for the author function of modernity. But that requires an understanding that it is possible that community collectivities can provide this type of function. If they do, it changes the knowledge infrastructure and disrupts established pathways for commodification. So that's why I'm interested in trying to bring open science and critical IP more closely together. As will be apparent, it's a recently undeveloped idea at the moment, but I do think this is a really important work to embark upon, and I'm looking for others who might be interested in the conversation and further developing this kind of framing. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Fascinating talk. And I think we have quite a lot to discuss and to cover. I like the floating applause. Oh, the emojis. I'm seeing this for the first time. So I would like to open up the floor for questions. I think I've seen some raised hands. Let me just try to get a sense of. Okay. Sorry, Lumi, did you raise your hand for a question? Correct me if I'm wrong.
I think I was just applauding Katie. Hi. So,
Okay.
But-
Okay. Would anyone like to start out the discussion, or do you have any questions? If not, then maybe I can just post mine. So the question I had, Kathy, as I was listening to you, I mean, one amongst many, but just an immediate one, the DOI and the ORCID identifiers. So you would characterize them as quite a different identification or persona than that of the author in copyright law. But doesn't it also still give us someone like a human person to trace back the data set or the publication to, in the sense, like we are not totally dispensing with the human originator altogether? Or do you think that's just something that's also going to just pass at one point?
So I think it's primarily designed as for twofold. So one is as a permanent identifier. So the argument is that you need something which isn't simply relying on a public infrastructure, but it's operating at a meta level above that. So there's a way in which there's systemic traceability. That's primarily where it's come from. It's also designed in order to make sure that research integrity and tracking of publications can be improved. Because one of the concerns, for example, in medical research is there's some studies done where even though there was a UK, I think it's a select committee, your terminology is slightly different from ours, that recommended that where there had been a expression of concern about some kind of medical research, then it should be corrected within a month. 90% of publications are not corrected. And in some fields, there's an Australian researcher who works in some fields of cancer, and because the original data coding was done very poorly, and then data mills propagated a lot of that information, the entire field is corrupt. And this has obviously really serious implications when people are actually having medical diagnosis and tests on the basis of completely inaccurate information. So the primary concern about using this kind of information is actually trying to actually mop up some of these kind of problems rather than it being forward-looking. But I do think the implications is one that, whilst I think for a long time we still identify ourselves as by our names, not by our DOI or our ORCID ID, but in terms of a systemic point of view, that's not the function that it actually is playing. It is actually facilitating this kind of easing the works into these types of systems.
Anyone like to ask a question or make a comment? Or type your comments and questions into the chat box also. Lumi?
Hi, I'm trying to start my video as well. Hi, thank you very much, Kathy, and thank you very much you for organizing. I noticed that in one of Kathy's slides, text and data mining was mentioned as one of the reasons why diffusion or outputs are not universally diffused, if my understanding was correct. Some limitations in the text and data mining exception. So I was wondering whether you have some thoughts that you would like to share in relation to this copyright exception, because in my opinion, the text and data mining exception should apply a bit differently depending on the type of copyright work in relation to which it is applied. So I was very curious to see your thoughts on this one. Thank you.
So I agree with you, Lumi. I personally do think everything to do with these knowledge system questions need to actually consider what kind of work we're talking about. What I was referring to in relation to what's perceived the limitations about them was the contradiction or I guess the tension between, for example, trying to identify if a use is commercial or non-commercial, and the uncertainty about how that applies at a time when our universities are all actively pursuing public-private partnerships, and how to actually work out what you can do with data once you've actually, you've mined it, but then can you actually use it? There's a lot of, coming out of the pandemic, there was a lot of questions around whether or not these were sufficiently both harmonized across jurisdiction, but also sufficiently robust in order to actually, that corporations, for example, would be happy to collaborate. So one of the arguments about copyrights and exceptions, particularly where they rely on this commercial, non-commercial divide, is the problem that it actually tends to then shore up the collaboration and sharing to what might be considered to be the much more speculative and very, very long-term kind of projects, rather than what's actually responsive to dealing with things like a pandemic.
Are there any other questions?
I can ask a question about about what we actually consider is the commodities when our research is available. I guess in conformity with an open science kind of thing. I'm not talking about once you've paid an article processing charge or whatever, but putting those questions about how it was made open available. Is there a commodity relationship there at all?
Maybe
I can ask a question directly. Thank you, Hyo
sure.
and Kathy. I was interested in what you were saying. It was what comes across in the interviews, whether you think that is a part of the problem or is a structural condition of the way the system works. That is, people do not care, are not interested, and is what makes that functioning, actually what makes that system to extract labor from academics. So it's not, it cannot be solved if people are interested. It's I guess, I mean, I think it's making the system more complicated or more that people needs to do things and more bureaucratic, that is the basis of the system. So thank you.
So in terms of how to improve the situation, in terms of Australian IP policies, our recommendations are that that academics don't have to deal with rights management or licensing at all. That under our legal system, as public universities, we're employees, and it is possible, and in fact, most universities do currently have entitlement as ownership of all our outputs. And what they do is then grant back to the academic the right to then sub-license it to the publisher, etc. I think that's crazy because it requires then the academic to actually make meaningful decisions first, that as if they can on an individual basis, but also that they have the skills and expertise. So one of the kind of like recurring thing is, how much do people need to know about IP? And the problem is that in terms of the rights management and the licensing, they don't need to know about it, and probably, don't want to know about it. And it's not reasonable to expect them to actually understand it or engage with it. But in terms of the meta questions about IP and the critical IP sense that I was talking about, understanding knowledge systems, most academics are really invested in that in their particular field. They're interested in how the journals are run where they're being published. They're interested, to some extent, engaging in grant activity and peer review and things like that, because they're interested in finding out what people are doing. They're in the public system, if you like, for a reason, and generally they're intellectually curious. So in that broader sense of that, basically what should be done, I think there is a willingness to engage it. The problem is that people actually don't understand that as IP work. And in that vacuum, that's where I think some of the, I guess, more bureaucratic and potentially concerning aspects of open science tends to creep in. In a sense, it creates its own bureaucracy, which is not the same as a publisher one, but it tends to operate in the same way.
Thank you.
Just want to draw your attention, Kathy, to Paula's question, which she has put into the chat. And she asks, how can we promote these important discussions in current public policy and AI/IP regulation spaces where the focus seems to be a tech companies versus creative industries binary and is more concerned with commercial implications? It also concurrently makes a commercial proposition for heritage data for AI training as per recommendation 13 of the AI Opportunities Action Plan. I think Paula's question speaks, I guess, to two broad concerns. One is how we can bring our academic discussions into the public policy space more generally, but also I think the current trend where a recourse to stronger copyright protection is seen as a kind of a pushback against AI scraping by private big tech companies. So, Kathy, what do you think about that?
Okay, so first of all, I don't actually have much faith in or even understanding about why we think that the state is actually regulating this space. It's not. Private corporations are regulating its space, and it's not regulated through legislation. It's regulated through contract in terms of legal points of, basically terms of conditions. So I'm actually more interested in actually studying or opening up conversations about the technology companies and their terms and conditions, and in a sense, the way that private ordering is constructed. And what is the space for example, ethical considerations in that space. A lot of the AI companies, in fact, make a lot of productivity claims and marketing claims about the benefits of their systems. At the moment, this is just all waffle. Why is it that when we participate in that there's no actual promise to make these real? We are kind of in the bubble phase of AI, although there are some signs that some of the investment in AI is actually falling apart because there's a lack of confidence that it is actually going to be able to deliver what's being promised. I think that's a good thing. But I've been shocked that I've been to AI conferences where we've had, and I'll talk about this in very vague terms, very large government department involved in, multi-million-dollar bespoke applications, which would be a commitment to integrating AI into government processes, probably in perpetuity once it's actually there. And I just asked, basically, and the argument was, we need mandatory guardrails and we need laws that increase transparency and accountability. And I just put up my hand and said, well, what's in your procurement contract? You're buying this technology off them. It's bespoke. It's a government, it's a government department for whom they are the only buyer for this type of technology. And the person sort of said, oh, well, yes, that's right. We've put human rights provisions in our contract. And it's like, you just despair. It's like, this is a very peculiar reliance, right, on very broad, human rights, because we know they're a power discourse today. You are the buyer of these technologies, and that happens at an individual consumer level, and that happens at a whole of government level. These are market technologies and market solutions, and the idea that somehow the state is going to regulate or is regulating this space is so naive. And sitting behind that, of course, one of the questions is that there's a reliance on things like confidentiality and other things to not make these transparent, and any government settlement around what is required it's going to be subject to contract. So I find that like a lot of the binary kind of approaches to AI bad, cultural industries good, and stuff like that is just a side conversation, and we're missing the point of what's actually going on and how things are being reconstituted and what law is in that space.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Paula, for your questions also. Melissa put a fun fact or a bit of gossip from open access civil society organization. I think you can read it for yourself, but I think it's really interesting in the sense of also how, when you think about the parallels and differences, for example, Kathy, between what is going on now and the open software or the open code movement. I mean, there's a weird inversion going on where copyright is bad. I mean, I guess as you've said earlier, it's not a binary; it's on a spectrum. But earlier with open software, we said there was a lot of critique that copyright is bad, open source would be good, Creative Commons would be good, and I think all of these kind of facile assumptions have been turned quite upside down. And I think Melissa's example is a good one of actually quite unintended consequences. So that's definitely a fun fact. Thanks for that, Melissa. Philip, please have the floor.
Thank you. I'd like to circle back to the opt-in and opt-out mechanisms that were mentioned from a legal perspective, particularly areas like IP law or consumer consent or contractual relationships. How does that distinction between opt-in and opt-out reflect the close and open approach to science?
So I think they're two different things. So opt-in and opt-out is being discussed in terms of agreement for your work to be source material for AI. In terms of but I see the analogy that you're talking about is with open science. There's an argument that there should be, or there may need to be a site-specific mediation about whether material is made available or not. So there is a way in which those two positions can be made to gel in that space. But I guess what I would argue is that one of the problems in both of those is that once you start reducing the concern around the integrity of, I guess, the information flow to an individual decision about whether or not this particular content can be used in that way, you are defaulting to a binary rather than looking at what's the system management overall and how are the, in a sense, the accumulation of those individuals' decisions, what are they building towards? Because for me, the broader question about but what does it look like when you put it all together is much more important than whether or not any individual decision falls one way or the other.
Thank you.
Are there any remaining questions or comments? Kathy, would you like to have some concluding words or comments?
Not really. I mean, I realize that this is a kind of like an odd conversation to occur in the IP space. It seems that there's the open source community and then there's the IP community. But I do think that and here I guess I'm talking to the critical IP community and the ISHTIP community in particular, that there's so much interest in kind of like the theories of IP, which are not really connecting with what's actually happening in the real world. And one of the issues is, for example, the pushback to is talking about commodification based on earlier obsessions with types of intangible property and how labour is extracted. This is also related to some of the work that Hugh's been doing around, the way that conversation has proceeded detached from considerations of questions of manufacturing, tariff policy, and other parts of the economy. I do think that if the IP community doesn't get on board with this discussion and start thinking about it more critically, not necessarily in terms of the open science space, but in terms of what is a technoscience infrastructure and what's the role of IP in it, that we'll continue to have lots of really fruitful IP conversations, which will be completely irrelevant because IP is simply not doing any of the work. And I do think there are a lot of interests that is actually a very good outcome, that, that we don't want complicated or sophisticated discussions about ways in which IP rights could be used, that the argument that IP, public rights equals good, private rights is bad, is just another stupid binary. What's the circumstance? What's the actual industry use? What's the actual case? Who does it affect, and how? They're the conversations that we need to kind of open up, rather than these kind of universalizing approaches to actually understanding or theorizing intellectual property.
So my question to the whole round is the author now really, really dead? Not just dead, but really, really dead. I don't know. I still like to hold on to the romantic notion of the human author, but probably I'm absolutely
but we'll have a human author. But for example, if you if you ask ChatGPT to summarize some of your works, you'll find that it'll represent you. It might refer to you as an author, but the material, the text that it's going to produce is going to have lots of stuff which has no relationship to what you wrote. So, we can still have a reliance on a human person or a human author in the traditional sense to authenticate knowledge, but it's not doing the actual work in the way in which it was actually intended, even when Foucault critiqued it.
Yeah, it's the ghost of the author then, so to say. Georg had a comment in the chat box. Additionally to the open science movement and the open source movement in software, there's a third field for the data tracking, AI feeding, and that is open GLAM in cultural institutions. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. Yeah. Okay. I think the time is almost up, but I'm really pleased that you joined us. We will actually have a series of online seminars in the coming academic year as part of ISHTIP. It's an effort to bring the community together a little bit more often than just one's annual workshop. So please keep your eyes posted on our website. We're also on Blue Sky. We are no longer on Twitter. That doesn't exist anymore anyway. But it's great to see you all. Great to see also some new guests and old friends. So thanks very much. Thank you so much, Kathy, for your time, despite being ill with the cold virus, flu virus, and it was really interesting. I think it gives us a lot of food for thought. So thank you again. Have a great summer, and we will be probably putting up the video onto the YouTube channel, ISHTIP YouTube channel, and I'll write an email about that if it's online. So thank you very much, and bye-bye.